Hey gang, as I said in another video, I want to take a look at some sine and cosine graphs and look at how do we go from the graph to writing the equation, and how do we go from the equation to writing the graph. So here we're going to start off with a graph. I think it's a lot easier to go from the graph to the equation. So we're going to look at this graph in the middle here for problem number 11. And what we're going to look at is first of all, what are A, B, the period, H, and K? What are all of those things? And that's going to help us write our equation. First of all, I'm just going to put up here our general graphing form. So remember, it's y equals A sine B times x minus H plus K. And remember that this B value, sometimes some books, some people will put that inside the parentheses. You can do that as well. I prefer to leave it outside the parentheses. It makes a little bit more sense with the H value then. So if I'm looking at my graph here, the first thing that I look for is I look for the middle of my graph. So I can see it's going down to -1 and up to +3. So the middle of my graph here, and sometimes I'll just draw a dotted line, middle of my graph is at 1. That is my K value. So K equals 1. Any sine or cosine graph you do, that's going to be the case. Next up, I'm going to look for my A value. And to find my A value, the easiest thing to do is to look, now that I've drawn this line in the middle, what's the height from the middle to the top? So from 1 to 3, that's a distance of 2. Okay, that's my A value. So my A value is 2. Next up, I'm actually going to look for the period length. So I still have these 3 left. Remember, the period length isn't part of your equation, but the period length is going to help us find the B value. So I'm going to look for the period length. And to do that, I've got a couple of options. I could look peak to peak, so like this peak here over to this peak here, or I could look valley to valley, or I could go from the middle of a cycle, middle of a graph I should say, to the end of one cycle. Now because the peaks and the valleys, it's not labeled exactly where they are, I'm going to avoid those this time. Usually I would use the peaks or the valleys to help me, but it's not clear where those are for sure. So I'm going to use the middle values here. So the middle of this, in between this peak and this valley here, is at 0. And if I go through one complete cycle, it takes me out to pi. So I'm going from 0 to pi. So from here out to here to finish one cycle. That's my period length. So my period length, 0 to pi, that's pi. And I could find that if I started at pi and I went out to 2 pi instead. I'd see the same thing. I start here and I finish one cycle. I'm going from 1 pi to 2 pi, still a distance of pi for my period length. Okay. From there, I'm going to move to my B value. My B value, the little handy way we can find that, P times B will always be 2 pi, because P is the length of one cycle. So for example, if the length of a cycle is pi, that means that we're going to be able to fit 2 of them in a distance of 2 pi. So our B value will be 2. Pi times 2 is 2 pi. Okay, so I'll just write this out for us. PB, so pi times B equals 2 pi. So B would be 2 pi divided by pi, or 2. So the B value here is 2. Now I'm going to write down most of my equation. So my A value is 2. I'm going to make it a sine graph, and I'm going to talk about how we could call this a cosine one as well. My B value is 2, so I'm going to plug that in. X minus H. Now I haven't found H yet, so I'm going to leave that open. Plus K, plus 1. Okay. whether you do sine or cosine, because you could use either for this graph, the a value will be the same no matter what. The b value will be the same no matter what. The period will be the same no matter what. The k value will be the same. The only two things that will change is your h value will change, and you may end up making the whole equation negative as well. Okay, so if we think about sine normally starts in the middle of its graph and goes up. So we could choose this to be our starting point, in which case that's at 0. So we would have x minus 0, or you could just put x in there, and that would be correct. And this could be the equation for our graph. But I'm going to show you a couple of other equations that would work as well. Instead of starting here at 0, we could go along our cycle. We could start it right here at pi, which means we could keep this whole equation the same, but we would put minus pi inside. Okay? And we could keep doing that. We could go along until 2 pi. We could plug in minus 2 pi. Or we could go backwards the other way and find out that at negative pi we could start, in which case it would be x plus pi. Okay? So really, we've got an infinite number of choices just by changing that h value. But we could also choose to start it right here. Sine starts in the middle of the graph. Okay? This one is going down first, so we would have to make it a negative a value. So for this one, we could say y equals negative 2 sine 2 x, and then if we start here, the h value is pi over 2, so it would be minus pi over 2, and then plus k, plus 1. So those are a couple of ways we could write this equation using sine. But we could also write it using cosine. Okay, so I'm just going to switch colors here. So using cosine, again, as I said, all the values except for h basically stay the same. So we still have 2 cosine 2 x minus something plus 1. Okay. Now cosine normally starts at its highest point. So here, our highest point, well, we can see it's halfway in between 0 and pi over 2. So that would be pi over 4. So for cosine, we would have x minus pi over 4. Okay. Again, we could start at other peaks though. So we could start out here, in which case we're halfway between pi and 3 pi over 2. Now that may get a little tricky for your counting, but basically 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4. Pi would be 4 pi over 4, and so then this peak would be 5 pi over 4. So we could also write this as minus 5 pi over 4. Okay. Something else to think about is basically we're going to pi. We're going a period length away. So if we take pi over 4 and we add 1 pi to that, we're at 5 pi over 4. Or we could start at a lowest point. So we could start here, for example, or over here. I'll use this point over here, in which case this point here we'd have y equals, and we'd start at its lowest point, so we'd have to make it negative because we're flipping the cosine graph. So negative 2 cosine 2 x, and now we'd be subtracting a negative, so it's going to be plus pi over 4 plus 1. Okay. So there's a lot going on here, but that's because there are so many different equations that we could write for this one graph. Okay. So the big thing though, first of all, is to identify k, identify a, find the period length, use that to find b, and then you can write your equations and decide where you want to start. That's going to give you your h value. It's also going to tell you whether you need to put a negative out in front. Okay. So this is going from a graph to an equation. I'm going to include another video where we start out with the equation and we go to the graph.